Good morning.
Good morning, Rica.
Good morning. I don't know
This is the new normal. This is it.
the right panel.
This is it.
So we're missing Manny. Manny, your mic is, perfect.
There we go. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, so now we can start again. This is so much
Okay. All right, let's do this one more time.
So how fitting is our topic of the new normal? This is 2022 and we're still talking about it. And as we see now, it's changing as we speak. It's changing as we speak. So today, with the esteemed panel, I'm happy to share some thoughts with you on how your organizations are dealing with COVID-19, the hyphenated acronym that came into our lives late 2019. Okay, so maybe Mandy, we start with you. My computer is acting up. And how has your organization dealt with the COVID-19 in 2020 and 2021?
Good morning, everyone. And once again, Abe, thank you for having me on this esteemed panel. To that question, I think, we, pre-2019 or the end of 2019, in our operations, we're rolling along. Our main objective is to engage with the agency personnel to exact capital energy efficiency projects throughout the city. That's 4,000 plus properties. So our engagement with agencies is on an energy basis. Come about January, you start to hear about the proliferation and the spread of COVID, and it's just touching down, and in Westchester, we're starting to kind of plan for that very lightly, but continuing operations as normal. And then in March, it hit that we were going to be working remotely, and then that changed the entire game. So not only would we have different interactions with our teams, using Teams mostly, and using remote applications to further our progress, but we would have to shut down some aspects of what we were doing, as the city's response was shifted mostly to bolster COVID and the pathogen mitigation, so that we could get back on track. We did not know that it would take almost a year and a half for things to kind of resume normalcy, but we had to frontline a lot of that COVID response and aid in the construction authorities and the other entities to help them get to where they needed to be. And that was either through staffing, assisting at centers of excellence or centers for COVID response. But our whole kind of game plan shifted, and we're kind of just starting to bounce back at the bottom or the top of this year. So.
Thanks. And Dr. Danielle, so talk about the shift in your organization, like just to go a little further on Manny's. How did it affect your organization and your space?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Rica. And I should first start to say I work with New York University. I'm the director of academic affairs for CUSP. So it's in the Tandon School of Engineering. And so higher ed institutions really all across the nation had to do a double pivot. We had to think about those working, on campus, but we also had to think about our student-facing aspects and what that meant, particularly because so many of our courses, I'm also associate professor, have always been in person. And so this pivot to an online presence was really a lot bigger. I think, couple years out, we're all kind of used to it. We understand when there's some delays as today, how to work through that, but really pivoting to change our logistics, and certainly with a focus on providing information for all of our students, parents, those who are working with us, and really focusing on two things, information for the general public, but also safety protocols. So we need to do in terms of masking, in terms of remote operations, to make sure that all on our campus were and are remain safe.
Okay, and Nancy, I've been living what you've been doing and the efforts you've been leading here at Con Ed. So maybe share with the audience some of the things that you spearheaded and worked on the team to help address how we responded to COVID.
Sure. Thanks, Rica. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yay. Finally, technology's working. Thanks for having me. Nice to meet all of you. My role is a little bit unique at Con Edison. My day job is the Vice President of Human Resources, but I gained another job with COVID as one of the incident commanders for our pandemic response and COVID response. So truly in the thick of it from, the very beginning. And I'll demark that line, the very beginning with March 2020, where we had our first positive case in the workplace. And then I know, as all of us have experienced, that took off, right? The virus exploded. And, we, at that point, it was really about, to what you just said, Dr. Wright, keeping our workforce safe. But at the same time, in a unique position, we have to serve our customers, right? We have to keep the lights on, the hospital's running. And so, finding that balance between sending all the folks that could work remote home and staying remote and safe. But we had, our field forces that were in every day since day one. And how do we keep them safe and out of harm's way? And then, as you all know, in the very beginning, no vaccines, so many unknowns about the virus, really not a lot of therapeutic treatments that were effective or at least consistently effective. And so it was very, very scary times. Just so all of those unknowns, with many of us getting the virus ourselves and our family members. Unfortunately, we've had 15 fatalities within our Con Edison family that we've had to deal with throughout, unfortunately. And so I think the shift from 2020 was just trying to figure out how we're going to continue, the work, business continuity, and making sure our customers were served, into 2021, where there was hope on the horizon with the vaccines, with the slowdown, right? We saw the peak, and then the summer months came and we all had a chance to breathe. And so I think our response was more about, now how do we keep our workforce safe? And, with the prevalence of multiple vaccines being available, it was really about getting folks vaccinated, those that were coming in, keeping them protected from, the continuing hazard, and then figuring out all of this technology and how to optimize our performance in this, this new world that we're all experiencing and will continue to.
So we just started, and the tone is the same, the message is the same, and the response is in the same ballpark. So, and you all talked about change. So how are you now addressing, 2 years in, addressing the change, the shifting needs of your employees and the customers you serve? So we all seen it from different perspectives. So I'll leave the floor open to see who wants to start with that one.
I guess I'll start in keeping with the order. For DCAS, and kind of coming back to the status quo, in and around this year, we've of course we're more conscious, and of everyone's surroundings. We operate at a scale that we did before the pandemic, while kind of increasing the awareness, increasing our accessibility to PPE. And there's also areas and support for mental health and other resources that are now available. And then there's also the awareness, the safety guidelines, OSHA requirements that have been established due to the pandemic, that we're all now have to keep kind of at the ready, and then respect. And then also respecting people's right to privacy, which is kind of a balance that is coordinated through our human resources department. But all of those things kind of work in concert. And I think, we've had a very high success rate to assimilating. I think we're 100% rolling along with our previous operations. From a business standpoint, now we have to think about incorporating um, COVID-related requirements and um, uh, things related to pathogens and public health into our capital project implementation sphere. And that may mean dialing back whole swaths of the scope, or reinvigorating or adding to it, bolstering our project scope to now include additional measures for ventilation, filtering, UV. All of that now comes into play. And in the greater, larger kind of conversation is, how do we add these requirements to buildings and then still operate from advantage of energy curtailment. And those things I can kind of get into a little bit later, but that's kind of been where we are, connecting with the agencies, figuring out what their needs are, aligning our capital structures, and then assimilating both energy and the public health requirement together as a new, more vigorous and more COVID-19 aware capital implementation schedule.
Okay, Dr. Wright?
Yeah, I would say, a lot of what Manny is saying, we talk about this new normal. I think part of the new normal is that this is it. So, not this undoing of a lot of the safety protocols that we've taken, but also knowing, there's an element of kind of policy versus politics, right? So how people feel about the social distancing and continuation of it. If you're in New York City, as most of us are, knowing that, there are these navigating the challenges between masking mandates, right? And so depending on whether it's a public or private structure, that may look differently. At NYU, we've certainly put out communications that masks is still required on all of our facilities and campus related activities, encouraging our students, to make sure that they are boosted, vaccinated, all those things. But then we also have to think about what it means for guests who are coming to New York City, first and foremost, and how that may differ for what it means to be like on campus. So a lot of our communications is really trying to walk that fine line with returning to a sense of normalcy. Some people see it as individual kind of privacy and what they can do, but also being respectful of the fact that not only is our campus quite large, but we're in a city, one of the largest cities in the United States. So a lot of that return is really about balancing. What I do see is that there is a level of respect, and I think Manny touched on that as well, in terms of the things that we might have had to say before over and over. People have kind of gotten used to a protocol of what it means to be in spaces with other folks. But I think one of the things working with a university setting is that our students really do want to be in a space where they're socializing. Faculty want to socialize. We're conducting research. We're having conversations. We're thinking about what that means. And so, the big question I think now is, what place does this kind of tech life, right, the social distance life have, as we kind of come back to, some efforts to do in-person communication. So a lot of that, and I think, we've worked really quickly when you think about it, 2 years to kind of get this protocol in place. But what the real strong point is going to be seeing how we, navigate that over the year to come, particularly with all the different variants.
All right, good. Nancy, I want to take you in a different direction. Productivity. One of the questions I always get from my employees is, why do they want us to come back? I'm doing twice more work at home. Like, why do I have to go back to take a team call on my computer? So Nancy, were you as a company in your position able to measure productivity current day during this COVID pandemic with half of our workforce being at home versus pre-COVID, and how have you noted like that increase or decrease in the productivity space?
So if yes and no. a little bit. Can you hear me okay?
No, yeah.
Okay. So I think it's both, right? So I look at our workforce and there's clearly, I divide it in two, right? There's the folks who can work remote and have been working remote for, let's say, the last 2 years. And then there's our field forces who have been here since day one, right? And so they're the ones who've been exposed most to the virus when they're here. We've had a lot of folks out because of the virus, and then subsequent being exposed to folks who had the virus and they're quarantined. So we've had a lot of absences on the field side just because of the close proximity. They are working together in manholes and service spots, in places where they can't socially distance. And so I would say we've seen probably a decline over some period of time, right? It could be months, but yeah, I would say if you looked at the numbers, and I have looked at them, you would see that like a good part of our workforce was either out COVID or out on quarantine. So hard to measure there. I think once we get back in and the Omicron is gone and hopefully variants are gone, we'll be able to get back to sort of looking at normal levels. On the flip side, I think with the remote workforce, definitely productivity, I don't know if you could say increases, but certainly less time for sure, right? So even if Rica, you don't feel great or you've got a mild version of COVID, you might continue to work, right? Because you can sit in your home and you can feel well enough to work. And so when you typically would have called in sick for a few days, you're not going to, right? So I think it's different things for different work groups. But I do think just bouncing off of what Dr. Wright said about, sort of how do you transition back in, not to go back to the last question, but I think culturally we need to figure out how we get that genie back in the bottle, because folks are like, I've done this for 2 years. Why can't I continue to do it? And I think culturally we really value the collaboration of folks being in person, having those conversations, deriving that energy from each other. That's really how we get our work done. So I think we're going to have to strike a balance between continuing with some hybrid version of what we've got.
Thanks for that, Manny. Dr. Wright, how does that differs in your space coming from academia, and Manny in the work that you're doing over at DCAS?
I would say, there are some protocols that are like set in place, and like, you have to do these things, or social distancing, and there's the things of that nature, but it's kind of a hybrid of, that, and then, one's own personal requirements, which we value here. We have spaces and requirements set up for those that are disadvantaged or those that need special requirements or special accommodations. So with COVID, we also have to honor that as well. And so that's where the space, the hybrid space becomes, a little more, I would say there's a lot more entropy to that, because you have to figure out what you consider, and this is really from an HR standpoint, what you consider, and then what needs to be evaluated as an ongoing kind of a symptom to what COVID, and how we're going to respond to that. Really, within our space, we're just trying our best to respect other people's area. So we're not meeting in large conference rooms. We're keeping most of our interactions with the agencies remote, unless we have to, if we have to go to site visits or things of that nature. We're trying to keep within the constraints of what seems to be within the bounds of good practice as far as COVID-19 goes. But all of that is kind of an amorphous situation, and like every case has its own outlier. So we're just kind of rolling with it. I think we've been doing pretty good. Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Wright, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, this is the question I love the most, because it's the one I get the most, and I think, much to what Nancy shared, and Manny as well, is that it also depends on who we're dealing with. So, in the academy in particular, faculty week sort of come and go anyway. And so one quick caveat is that I'm at NYU, I'm born, raised, proud New Yorker. But I have a lot of experience with Austin, Texas. I've come from the University of Texas, Austin. And so the other thing to be thinking about is who's in the room. So, this kind of idea of kind of hybrid mix and moving back and forth, fluidity, is a lot more common, for different realms. Senior management, and this may be the same for you all with your area. So senior management, certainly faculty, they all have had kind of, I won't say free reign, but a lot more autonomy over their schedules. It's our frontline folks. So for us, it would be like our janitorial staff, our food service providers. Those are the folks who, couldn't really pivot as quickly, much, and I heard Nancy say the same thing. And so for them, making sure that for those who could pivot, we were doing that. We were taking that step back so that you make really the campus a lot safer for those who have to be in play. In terms of productivity, I think that really folks in the beginning, it was like a transition. I mean, like, who am I talking to? When is something due? Not having kind of like that presence that we all love, that social presence. But I think what I found is that the folks who understand their craft well, they were navigating it anyway. I think so. Rather than an issue of, does the productivity go down? What I would say is my experience is that I've seen it either plateau, stay around the same, or go even higher above. The other end to that, though, is thinking about issues of burnout, right? So what do we do when somebody decides that they're going to keep their work protocol going from, 4 in the morning? Nancy, cover your ears. I know you're HR and this may your protocols around it. But, when people just, can't turn it off, those are some of the negative impacts that, we're thinking through. But on the other side, particularly for, those who are primary care providers, whether you're a parent, whether you're taking care of an aging person, what has happened is the schedules are much more autonomous. And so people really can both get their work done and take care of things that, as Nancy mentioned, they might have had to take a few days off. So for new workers, those folks who are coming in and may not have as much leave time, it's been a benefit, it's been a value. For those who've got morning drop off, if you've got kids, like I do in young grades, you're navigating now both not only the workforce where you are, but what does it mean in terms of our other institutions, so our schools, so bus services, all of those things kind of play in. So, I don't know if any of you saw the Vox report. They just did one. They've got several reports, but they just did one on whether productivity levels are higher or have they dropped off. And that report actually says that while productivity is positive, it's either positive or it's remained the same, the amount of work that individuals are taking on, because maybe we also know we've got like the great resignation going on. So for those who, may not have felt like they were getting paid at a certain rate, haven't been able to take leave, and they've just said goodbye, the weight of that portfolio now falls on the same folks who remain. So I think the balance for that is not so much are workers productive, but what are we doing in the workplace to make sure that, as more work gets put on, that there's a real work-life balance. And that's a conversation I think prior to COVID, the idea of work-life balance seemed like that's something for a startup to think about. We don't do that in most traditional systems. So I think that's introduced a new conversation.
All right, good conversation as I expected. So let's shift it a little bit now and trying to look at the data in terms of the demographics of the people that are dying and getting severely ill from COVID. Are you seeing, based on your experience or what you've seen, that people of color are being more impacted in that space?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We know, Blacks make up about 13% of the population, and yet the rates for COVID, sickness, and death, combined with something like 23%, which when you think about issues of proportionality, or in our case, disproportionality, those numbers just speak, for themselves. I think the big concern really, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, but we still see that playing out, are issues of access to, proper health care. That's been an ongoing issue. We hear the word exacerbated a lot in COVID dialogue, but we know that remains to be the same. If you didn't have good access to health care, long-term health care prior to COVID, you're likely to be just as impacted and maybe more impacted during COVID. Issues of healthcare, not only in terms of kind of primary care services, but what happens with access to emergency care when the hospitals are filled up. and how that ties and connects into our communities of color, where we know that the correlation between income and race is strong. So it's not an issue, and I always want to say this when I'm in broader audiences, it's not simply a matter of, people have COVID because they're Black or because they're Hispanic. It's because of those access or lack of access to certain resources that are often tied into our zip codes, so where you live. So we've seen a lot of correlation between the experience, right, in terms of exposure, in terms of health access, and certainly in terms of, let's talk vaccination rates, right, among Black and Hispanic populations. And then I'd say the other piece, in addition to access and healthcare, we're thinking about issues of just messaging, right, around vaccination. We know that traditionally in the African-American culture, there is some level of skepticism because of the history among Black populations. So a lot of that, in terms of access, in terms of experience, they're correlated, they work closely together. But we've seen that combination of those things really impact Black and Brown, really BIPOC communities across the board.
Okay, Nancy, like what's your viewpoint when it comes to seeing that in Con Ed as a whole, or the communities that we're serving?
Yeah, so I, on the whole, I would have to say, I think I'm getting.
You're breaking up.
Can you hear me?
You're breaking up.
I'm sorry. Maybe I blow my microphone. You hear me better? Yeah, sorry. So I think at Con Ed it's a little bit different, right? Because we have a New York City vaccine mandate. So the majority of our employees have got vaccinated, which fortunately I think reduced the amount of serious illness and hopefully in the future fatality. So like over 90% of our population is vaccinated. I would say that the fatalities that we experienced, I mentioned earlier, we saw within Con Ed that COVID did not discriminate. Actually, we had pretty equal proportion of folks who passed away from the virus. And the predominance was that they were not vaccinated. So that's just in Con Ed. It was like nothing stood out. There were more African Americans or Hispanics that passed away from the virus. Actually, more white males. There was only one female. So I'd say there was more gender disparity here within our place. But I think to Dr. Wright, it's a much bigger, it's a more systemic issue that I think requires another panel and a much deeper discussion. I will just mention, I don't know if she's joining us in the summit today, Tone McGath is one of my employees, she's one of the managers. But very proud to say she's on a 2-year fellowship with the CEO of Action for Racial Equity. And this is exactly what that group of folks is doing. It's 100+ companies who've given their dedicated staff to work on racism as a public health crisis, all the things that Dr. Wright said, access to care, trust the medical, the medical system. And so I think that really is how to change local, public, federal policy around some issues that can move the needle on that. So I think it's probably requires a completely different panel discussion. It's so
I agree with both the other panelists. From our perspective, we don't monitor the mortality rates due to COVID, but we do see the indirect and more direct effects of it just in the portfolio of buildings that we serve, and it's quite obvious that there is a correlation to where areas of underserved that are underserved in the community, or areas where people are more packed in, or areas where there are more shelters, or people that are disadvantaged in a certain proportion, that there are obvious cases and obvious increases to the number of mortality rates. The agencies that we see that most in are the Department of Homeless Services. We had to increase response, obviously, for health and hospitals. They had their own task force with the construction authorities to mitigate the effects of COVID. But just within our agencies, the amount of maybe people of color that are don't have or didn't have the couldn't afford the ability to work from home. I think that there's a disproportionate amount of people that were actually in the field working during COVID, that we did monitor, and some of those we did experience fatalities within our own administration. Um, the numbers we don't track, but we do see the effects of it and how our agencies have to shift their response to try to basically serve the communities that um, they're responsible for. So yes, not tracking the numbers directly, but have seen the effects of it.
And I think the bigger picture here is looking at how it's affecting like the bigger community, and both of you guys alluded to that in your response. Dr. Wright, anything to add in that space before we move on?
Oh, I'm happy when more panels and discussions come up. Invite me back.
Yes. And just to carry this a little further, do you guys think that there is a link between the susceptibility to COVID-19 and environmental justice? Like Nancy and Manny talked a little bit about the next steps and the bigger picture. Anything to share on that link between the two?
Definitely. And this is, something that I guess DCAS are kind of monitoring a little bit more closely. With the increase in the heat index uh, due to greenhouse gas emissions, um, there is a correlation to the increased spread of pathogens and increased susceptibility based on infrastructure to environmental concerns. And so those things kind of work hand in hand. And it seems like the numbers they kind of correlate within communities that are disadvantaged. And it really does kind of center around infrastructure. In a shelter or in a particular housing development, you may not have the ability to even filter air because you don't have air systems, because either that's not part of the policy or um, programs related to providing that are lacks for money. Whatever the case may be, usually the infrastructure kind of speaks to the level of susceptibility for those buildings or those communities. And, obviously it's going to be a little bit harder when you have to correct maybe years of kind of unattended areas and buildings where maybe safety protocol or just normal ventilation or whatever the case may be. Now you have to account for that, budget for that, call in energy into that, budget for all those concerns. So before that had its own task force. Now we're frontlining that, as well as the mayor's office of what used to be sustainability, now is the mayor's office of climate and environmental justice. That whole effort is being frontlined to where environmental justice and climate justice and just process for that. They're developing reports and they're developing new local laws to serve communities, because it's obvious that where environmental susceptibility goes up and where you have increased where you're more imposed with climate changes in these communities, there's a direct energy correlation. So now we're looking at bolstering our capital plans with those concerns. And then the mayor's office is working on creating a task force, an advisory board, just to deal with environmental justice. So there's a report that's coming out. The advisory board is going to be planning activities based on that report. And of course, we're going to be involved in that as we have to develop kind of the framework that's going to be the basis of that. So, and there's also local laws that deal with um, creating awareness for those that occupy the buildings, energy scores, benchmarking, um, awareness of targets for what will help us curtail the greenhouse gases. Um, Lots of local laws, Local Law 89 puts the information in front of the agency so that we can have it broadcast back to us so that we know exactly where our targets are, as our main target is mostly 80 by 50, which is 80% of metric tons of greenhouse gases reduced by the year 2050, and that's from a benchmark of 2005. So all of our efforts now are being concentrated into those areas as we believe in general that we can have the most impact. So we're looking at a holistic approach to that, from the envelope to the air systems and HVAC, to just even behavioral kind of methodologies that will prepare the staff to utilize the technologies to bring about the change that will create preparedness for environmental and public health concerns going forward in the future. So yes, there's a correlation, and yes, environmental justice has a big part to do with it.
Okay, thanks for that. So Dr. Wright, I'm gonna go to you for this next topic. Talk to us about some of the things that NYU learned during this pandemic.
Well, one of the things I think that speaks to Manny's comments on environmental justice, we've already been talking a little bit about, what our role is as really a major institution in a major city is. How can we be modeling that behavior? And so, when you carry your footprint, I love hearing that, Manny, what you were talking about, with your particular company, is because thinking a little bit about the footprint, what is the impact, that a population the size of NYU can have, and modeling that for the city. So, we have our own efforts on the way to really reduce our carbon footprint, and then over the next 10 years, getting students involved with, thinking about that water bottle. Remember, just 10, 15 years ago, water bottles were the thing, and now it's the carryable, reusable, right? And getting into the habit of that. I think, there's this focus on institutional messaging and responsibility. And so when I hear this conversation, about environmental justice, I'm so happy to also hear climate justice, because it's something that we know has really gone back and forth. It's kind of been on the radar for a long time, but not really at the forefront. So NYU really is making efforts not only in our policy, but in our actions to make sure that everyone, from the president, students, parents, those who are thinking about coming to the university, understands what it means when they're undertaking the university's footprint. And then the last thing I'd say is, what I think COVID has done is really help create a platform for things that we've been talking about in our communities, time and time again. We know the impact of places like Flint, Michigan, in terms of water access. But let's talk about water rights, right? What happens if you live near the source versus if you don't? And who are those folks, right? And what do they look like? Let's talk about severe impact on weather. There are places across the country that never see it. I won't say never, but very rarely have seen things like snow. And so, suddenly you're getting these really cold winters. And so what impact does it have for our energy use utilities? So I think that there's a lot of responsibility, not only NYU in itself, but even as we're talking about state level, we're talking about federal level. What can we do to make sure that these companies, right, who are looking for homes in our city, particularly our tech companies, right, are really picking up the mantle? And so it's more than a soundbite. It's actually putting action, behind our talk about what we want to do.
Okay, and Nancy, from the utility space, what are some of the things that Con Ed learned during this pandemic that we're going through?
I raised my volume so I could hear everybody. Then I have to lower it because I hear myself too much. So yeah, I think we can all say that we have learned how incredibly challenging it is to deal with technology, but also how helpful it could be. So I think that, we are different than we were 2 years ago. I don't think any of us will go back to the same, the same workplace the same way we work with each other just because of that technology. So I think that we're going to continue to leverage that and be able to meet employees where they are. I think what Dr. Wright said earlier, just about, being overproductive, bad thing, right? It's just exhausting and really can cause some health issues for folks. But what a great balance we've been able to strike with fitting in, picking up your child at 2:20 from school. What working parent can do that, right? Or caring for, an aging parent or relative. And I think that what we've learned is we are resilient. We learned how to be flexible. And I think that we really have to stay flexible, be able to really respond to the need of, what our workforce is looking for in terms of staying some version of hybrid. And we will continue to kind of learn how to utilize that technology to keep us collaborating, but also be able to strike that balance that people have achieved by being able to work remote most of the time.
All right, thanks. And Manny?
Well, I mean, it's shown us that you can kind of never be too prepared. Usually the protocol is, you just kind of put the money where the need is. I think in the future and going forward, as is part of this establishment of the different protocols at the mayor's office, I think the protocol is going to be just kind of build the resiliency into whatever you're doing. So no longer are we just focusing on, just the equipment. No longer are we just focusing on controls and things of that nature. We're focusing on a holistic building approach so that we can tackle these things from the onset. And that includes preventative aspects. That includes interfacing with the facility operators. It includes the whole 9 yards. And then internally, I feel like we're more cognizant of the burgeoning need within the city to just kind of equalize the playing field for everyone. And so, to the local law 97 effort where we have to take buildings and then provide or get a plan to make sure that we're hitting our targets, we're now looking at these different areas more and more to say, okay, there's a lot that we can do here. Let's get everybody on board. Because then I guess the last part of it is just changing changing just the mindset. I think that's kind of where it starts. And I think COVID changed a lot of people's mindsets on what could actually be. I don't think anybody had any, no one was really prepared for what we're dealing with. Now that we know that this is possible and we know who is being impacted more, usually the people that are impacted more have less say. We're now starting to put that on the front line and make sure that we as a culture can influence cultures that we're trying to establish a greater COVID response in. And that's kind of like the ongoing goal. That's how things have changed within our relative plan.
Awesome segue to my next question. So the title of our panel is The New Normal. So what does that mean to you? What does that look like to you after today in your organization? And Dr. Wright, you can start.
I think it just means a willingness for flexibility and patience where we can, offer it. I call it grace. That's just my background. But I also think, thinking and really expanding who it is that we talk to about what works and what doesn't work. When we talk about, and hearing Manny talk about, right, bringing more folks into the fold and being listened to, I think that's going to be really critical. When COVID first, became an issue to the point that we really had to go to remote operations. I remember hearing folks say, well, let the businesses run it. They know what to do. And I won't say argument, but my caveat to that would be people in communities know exactly what they need to do. People who are working for our institutions know what they'd like to see happen. So, my hope is that the new normal will be a much more open door to collaboration from people from the ground up. Because I think that's where we get some of our best solutions from.
Nancy?
Rica, can you repeat the question I lost you when you started out? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so in talking about new normal, what does that look like for you, for your organization, the community that you serve? What does that new normal look like or mean to you and your organization?
Sorry, I don't have the sound issues. So I think I heard most of it. So I think we talked about it in the beginning of this call. This is the normal. So I think we should, I don't know, the new normal is sort of an old phrase, right? I think this is just, I think it's been an eye opener, right? And I think that moving forward, none of us are going to let our guard down, right? In terms of, is there another variant on the horizon? So I think we're optimistically cautious that maybe Omicron was it, but some experts say that's not the case.
Nancy? If anyone, while we pause, if anyone has any questions, please send it to us in the chat, and I will be able to see the questions as they come in. So if you have any questions for the panelists, you can enter them in the chat. Nancy, we lost you for a couple seconds.
I know. I'm sorry. This is not ideal. This is the bad part about technology. So I'm not gonna. I'll let it go to questions because I know we're running out of time.
Okay.
I just think we're just gonna have to be cautious moving forward. I think we know how to deal with the pandemic, so we've got a lot of the structure in place, and I think we're just gonna have to be on the lookout. And I don't know. Everyone said what I would have already said. So appreciate the opportunity.
And Manny, before you answer, I'll just add one piece to it. Are you, when you think about the new normal and how we go forward, are you incorporating feedback from your customers, from your employees to kind of structure what that looks like going forward?
Most definitely. I think the new normal can become the old normal really quickly in this environment. So we have to kind of roll with the punches and then, as it's been mentioned, meet our customers where they are. And that might mean shifting concerns. That might mean that we have to change our plans up. That might mean that we need to increase our roles in educating agencies about energy management and how that affects resiliency, environmental and climate changes, and all of that. So yes, for our business model, it means a lot more communication because now we have to collectively take into account dealing with public health matters and then make sure it's rolled into all of our operations. We can't just operate from the vantage point of, hey, this is this building. I like it because it's very energy, hoggy. We need to affect it. It's like we have to look at what they're dealing with, listen to what their needs are, and then apply them into our concept of what needs to be delivered. So, and then just internally, we're making sure that everyone is informed of what new policies there are. Our heads and our commissioners have been really great about informing us of what's to come. And so I think the environment is good here. And we'll continue to interface with the agencies and our clients and our customer base just to ensure that everyone has the same access to our services and that there's equity across the board for energy curtailment as far as GHG to then affect the pathogen spread and mitigate that concern.
Okay, so far we have no questions. Again, use the chat if you have any questions. But my last question to the panel would be, looking at yourself as leaders in the last 2 years, what's that elevator speech, the 30-second elevator speech of what COVID taught you about yourself in this new way of working and leading the people that you do on a daily basis?
I guess I'll chime in on that one. I guess my 30 seconds starts now. So I would just say that, as it's mentioned here a few times, it's just patience. you have to have patience for other people's requirements and needs, and that's inside the office, and that's dealing externally with your customer base. In order to meet someone head on, there need to be acquiescences, and there need to be there has to be a collaborative effort to where you guys both work to a common ground. And so I would say, just like anything, just like with this pandemic and adapting to this new normal, patience is critical. And then also working out optimal and timely schedules within that period of patience is also critical as well.
Okay. Dr. Wright?
Oh, I think, Manny covered it really. It's again, I said about giving grace, but also, being clear about where you really can have some flexibility and maybe where, you need to hunker down. I think that's one thing. I know certainly I've learned I'm one of those persons that kind of takes it on, everything at home, everything at work. And I really, I guess my caveat for myself when I share with the audience is, there's something to be said about not being over busy. So just because you have time to schedule it in, especially because, one thing we didn't talk about, but is mental health issues. And so I think we really broadened our understanding of what it means to have mental health and peace. And so that's something I've learned and, going to continue to learn and hope to do that, give that same experience of learning with my team.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the piece about mental health, and I'm gonna put Nancy on the spot to expand on some of the things that I know we're doing in Con Ed on that topic as she close us out.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm stressed out. My mental health is at risk here. So yeah, I mean, I think we've all acknowledged that just COVID alone, right? The anxiety and stress, and then so many of us, myself included, who lost loved ones to COVID, and then the constant, being on constantly, managing the kids, the relatives, all of that whole ball, I call it, of COVID, has really impacted mental health. And I think for us on Ed, we have tried, not just through COVID, but the last few years, to remove that stigma from mental health, and sort of, there's this stigma associated with mental health versus physical health. Like we don't get somebody weird because they get cancer or heart disease, but mental health still has a stigma associated with it. And we're really trying to eradicate that by doing a lot of training for supervisors to just know how to have a conversation with someone who they think may be struggling, knowing the right words and knowing that it's okay to check on people. So in terms of that, we're really trying to raise awareness here. We have resources available to employees, but I think just that continuing recognition that mental health is like any other health concern. We really need to be able to address it and help our employees deal with what we're all dealing with, right? So, so that's what I have to say about mental health, Rica.
I want to cut in really quickly and just kind of mirror what Director Wright and Nancy are saying. That I feel like that's an important thing. Of course, it may be another entire panel discussion all together, but the mental health is just like any other health consideration, and I feel like sometimes that's overlooked, and that's where the patience and that's where the grace comes in, and then making sure that you're allowing a space for people to deal with what they have to deal with in the face of COVID, but then also know when to, come in with suggestions and resources and things that you have to apply in a leadership position. It's a delicate balance, but COVID, I think, has kind of prepared me and maybe us all to more readily deal with concerns of that nature, where you're having to not only think about output of whatever business model you have, but think about the health mentally and physically of just who's under your purview.
Okay, good. Really happy to spend the morning with you guys. A lot of information for the attendees. If you can go back to the agenda page and click into the closing session. Dr. Wright, Nancy, Manny, thank you so much for spending time with us today.